for raising your glasses. I have to drink what looks like an old man's picnic. It's in fact hot water and lemon and lime because I have almost no voice left. I don't know whether any of you ever ring India when you have problems with your computer, or you're trying to get a train from London to Milton Keynes, and you get that person. Well, that person, when he's not explaining how your computer works, is also a journalist. There are 7 of them, and they all work for different Indian newspapers, and I spoke to all of them the other day for 6 hours, so I've got no voice left. Rachel Johnson said that I asked for £2 a word. I asked for 2p a word, and she said the lady couldn't run to that. When my mother heard that I rang my mother the night I won the Booker Prize. You've heard that I've won the Booker Prize. And that night... No, not again. No. And I rang my mother that night to tell her, and she said, I know, we've just been listening to the news, but I'm upset about one thing. I said, what's that? She said, I didn't hear the end of your speech. And I didn't hear the end of your speech because they had to cut short because the Chilean miners were coming up. And she said those miners had been down there 3 months. Would 10 more minutes have hurt any of them? I'm not going to talk about my mother. I thought I'd talk about my father tonight because I think my father is probably the reason I wrote the book that I've just written. My father, in a way I'll explain, liberated me. He liberated me by dying. This isn't going to be a sad story, but it is about my father's, the importance to me of my father's death. This isn't callous. This is me being funny and touching again. You'll have read about all that. My mother was the person who read books in my house. The reason I had the music of literature in my ear early was because my mother read Palgrave's Golden Treasury with me. My father never read a book in his life. When my father saw the first novel that I'd written, I dedicated it to my mother and father. He said, that's such a sweet thing for you to have done. How much did that cost? Because it assumed I'd taken one copy out to a printer and got to my mother and father stamped on it. He couldn't conceive that a book could come like that, with his name, to my father Max, with his name in a book. I left him with the book and went on my way and went back to Manchester some months later to see how he was getting on. And he said, I'm going to try and read this. And he said, I think I'm getting somewhere. He had still not got past that page where they talk about the publishing history of the book. It's got an ISBN number. And it's also got that, the conditions of sale. And he'd been reading for months the conditions of sale. He never actually got into the story. My father was a children's magician. He was a taxi driver and he worked on the markets. But mainly what he wanted was to be a children's magician. I was very ashamed of him being a children's magician because I thought that was a naff thing to have a father who did tricks. He did absolutely terrible tricks. The tricks were, not only were they disastrous, but they were very upsetting for the family. Because he took my rabbit. I had a little rabbit. And this had been a rabbit which we weren't good on animals in our family. We weren't sure we hadn't come from a place where people had we'd had a goat, I think. But we didn't know about animals. But I was bought a rabbit and had a little rabbit. My father made it, because he was also a carpenter, my father. He made a little hutch for the rabbit, put the rabbit in. And then one day he said, I think I could use that. I thought he meant the hutch. He meant the rabbit. And he incorporated the rabbit into his act in the usual kind of way. He would do blah, 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 blah. Then at the end of the evening, he would pull out my rabbit. It was actually called after me. It was called Howard the rabbit. Pull Howard out of the thing. The next time I was now not looking after the rabbit because I decided it was my father's rabbit, and that was that. I'd fallen out of love with the rabbit that my father had made a fool of. He'd made a schmuck of my rabbit was now a stage act. The next night when my father 2 nights later, my father tried the same trick, ended up with the stage, pulled the rabbit out of his jacket, dead, stone dead. There's one trick that goes down badly with a room full, particularly of children. It's the one that ends with a dead rabbit coming out of the thing. What he'd done was he'd forgotten the time before to take it out of the inside of his pocket. So it had sat in his suit in a wardrobe for 2 or 3 days. The other trick which shamed the family was one in which he was very interested in levitation. And he wanted to levitate my mother. My mother wasn't the kind of woman that went in for being levitated. It wasn't her shtick. And he did try levitating my mother, and my poor mother just lay there flat on the board, not unlike the rabbit Howard, I have to tell you, and exhibiting the same degree of life as the rabbit Howard. And that didn't work, and finally she said, no, I'm not going to do that. So my father had this idea. He went to a porno shop and bought a blow-up porno doll and borrowed some of my mother's clothes and dressed the porno doll in my mother's clothes. This is a very, very upsetting thing for a son to see. First your father kills your rabbit, then he dresses a porno doll up as your mother. But he'd perfected, so he dressed the porno doll up as... This was to be his pièce de résistance for an act in a big hall in Manchester, which if the trick worked, he would then become a member of the Magic Circle. So a lot hung on this. And he'd perfected an air pump. And his idea was that if he could levitate the doll, instead of my mother, the doll could actually be flat underneath a blanket and no one would know what it was. And he'd invented something, because he was an inventor too, he'd invented a floor pump. So that the doll on the stage was just this flat table and then a blanket and nothing apparently underneath. And then he'd press the foot pump and the doll would blow up and eventually become my mother. It became my mother, but then the foot pump jammed. And the porno doll, Akka, my mother, rose higher and higher and higher until it got to the lights at the top of the stage and then exploded. And I and my brother and my sister and my mother herself, who was there, had to watch my mother's underthings floating down all over the theatre. Meanwhile, while this is going on, I know we're not meant to read things, but I just want to read a tiny little thing. While all this is going on in my house, I'm trying to be a writer. And the writer I want to be is Henry James. I don't realize that I've got wonderful material in the house to be a writer. I'm writing this. And I've actually got, this was from one of the first novels I tried to write. For Hugh St. John Vereker, the day had gone, all things considered, swimmingly. Though he was himself no swimmer, not a man of water, truth to say, of any sort, well, swimmingly well. He contemplated in their all too subtle efflorescence the gardens which the night before, was it only one night, had borne mute witness to the first and so far only indiscretion of his young and still all too beautifully untouched life. I didn't proceed very far as a novelist in this mode. Now, it does occur to me that when I first thought I would read this to you, it would be to prove, how far I've come. But I now have a suspicion that had I gone on in that vein, I might have won the Booker Prize much earlier, actually. I don't know how my voice is. Excuse me for a sec. I've also covered the watch with my paper. How long have I had? 9 minutes already. Right. What saved my life was that my father, I said to you that my father died. Apart from wanting to write novels like Henry James and not realizing that in the family in which I lived, I had all the material that I needed. A very strange, puritanical family I lived in which no one was allowed to swear and no mention of the body was ever made. I don't want you to think that this porno doll suggests that there was anything lewd or pornographic about my father or my family. We were absolutely the opposite. How he knew where to get that doll, I have no idea. We were a very puritanical family. The body was never mentioned. Indeed, we lived in a small house, 2-story house, 5 of us. Indeed, when any member of the family went to the toilet, we didn't call it the bathroom, it was the toilet, all the other members of the house had to go downstairs. because there was never to be any bodily noise associated with any member of the family. So if my mother wanted to go to the toilet at 3 o'clock in the morning, my father would knock on the various bedrooms and say, right, down. So we'd all go downstairs. And because there was a fear that even if we were downstairs, we still might hear some bodily noise, we all had to sing. So anyone passing our house at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning would have wondered why the whole family was up downstairs singing "She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain When She Come." People who knew would have said that's Mrs. Jacobson taking a leak again. But apart from this being a problem, my other problem was my father was extremely protective of me and didn't want anything to happen to me and didn't want me to see anything upsetting. And he was the kind of man who was always where trouble was. In the times when we worked on the market and I travelled with him in a van, we were often driving back from Liverpool to Manchester on the East Lancs Road, there would be an accident. My father always knew when there'd be an accident. My father could see in a field half a mile away a vehicle on its back with its wheels spinning in the road. My father would pull up, go running out, and as soon as we got to the car, my father would do this to me. And then I knew that there was some terrible, terrible sight in the car. He did this for years. We'd be out walking, just strolling, and we'd suddenly find ourselves walking past a burning house. My father would run into the burning house, tell me to stay outside, bring out God knows what bodies on his arm, under his arm, bring out bodies. I'd peer to have a look. He'd go like that. So I was never allowed to see anything. This is why I wrote that kind of prose. I was not allowed to see anything in life. And then finally my day, this is a totally true story. All my stories are true stories. Finally the day arrived for me to be a man, and I went to Cambridge. My father took me to the railway station, carried my bags, saw me into the carriage, and did the thing that men did in those days. You know, you see now men embracing everywhere. The other night when I won the prize, did I mention that I won the Booker Prize? The other night when I won the prize, I kissed so many men. I just hugged and kissed men. And I thought, had my father been watching this, he would have been extremely anxious. What's happened? What's happened to his boy? Could it have been what he did to the rabbit that had affected me all these years later? But when my father took me to the train to Cambridge, men did not embrace. You did not embrace your father. You punched them. You punched one another on the shoulder. There was a lot of that. It was all so he punched me on the shoulder and said, you know, you're going to be a man. This is terrific. And I was thinking, you bet it's terrific. I'm going to get away from you. I can see things. The whole of my life is starting. I'm a man at last. He sat me down in the compartment, gave me one more punch, and then suddenly did that. He'd sat me down opposite a dead man. And this was a guard or something who turned a very strange green or yellow, and he was dead. I feel extremely sorry now over those years for anyone who my father happened to walk past, because it meant their chance of survival was extremely low. Anyway, so on my first day as a man into the world, he was in charge again. And only 15 years later, it's long ago than that. It's 15 years ago that he died, and he gave me that bell. What's the point of winning the Booker Prize if I have to be... And it was his, and when he died, it was the moment in which I thought I can finally be, it broke my heart because I loved him. But it was a huge liberation, really, that I was exposed finally. Everybody says that about when your parents die. You're on your own. There's no further wall of defense. I was on my own. And in the end, a writer needs to be on his own. And at that moment, I stopped being just a funny writer and became a tragicomic writer. I owed it all to him, actually. He was the one that gave me the comedy. He was the one that gave me the seriousness. He's gone. I'm on my own. I'm vulnerable. Just be sorry for me. Good night. Thank you.